The battlefield was a graveyard of burning wreckage, twisted metal, and bodies, both human and alien. Smoke choked the sky, turning the sun into a dim, red specter hanging over the wasteland. The Xel'thar commander, General Valzor, stood atop a ridge, his piercing yellow eyes scanning the chaos below. His forces were superior in every way. Better weapons, stronger armor, advanced energy shielding. And yet, his army was losing. It made no sense. Humans should have been wiped out in the first wave. Their ships were crude compared to the sleek war vessels of the Xel'thar Empire. Their soldiers carried projectile weapons, primitive relics in an age of energy warfare. And yet, as Valzor watched, a single squad of human soldiers dismantled one of his assault mechs using nothing but explosives made from scavenged fuel cells and jagged pieces of metal. A massive explosion rocked the battlefield, sending a shockwave through the air. Valzor shielded his face as one of his own tanks erupted into flames. He turned to his second-in-command, disbelief flashing across his reptilian features. "How?" he demanded. "They have no weapons left. They should be retreating." His officer, a nervous Xel'thar lieutenant, swallowed hard. "They don't retreat, sir. They adapt." Below, the humans fought like creatures of pure instinct, using whatever they could find as instruments of war. A soldier hurled a broken rifle like a spear, piercing the weak spot of an enemy's armor. Another strapped grenades to a severed Xel'thar limb and threw it into a cluster of unsuspecting aliens, detonating it like a grotesque bomb. Even the wounded refused to lie down and die. One human, missing an arm, used his remaining strength to rig a landmine out of a shattered helmet and a leaking fuel cell. Valzor watched, frozen in horror, as a group of his warriors charged a trench, expecting an easy victory. Instead, the humans used their own dead as shields, pushing forward with grim determination. A soldier snatched a plasma blade from a fallen Xel'thar and drove it straight through another alien's armor, twisting it with brutal efficiency. "This is madness," Valzor muttered. No species fought like this. Every race he had encountered in his long military career had a limit, a breaking point where they would surrender or flee. But humans turned their desperation into an advantage. A human officer, clad in bloodied armor, stood atop a pile of wreckage, holding a makeshift staff, nothing more than a broken rifle jammed into the severed arm of a Xel'thar warrior. He raised it high like a battle standard, his voice booming across the field. "Everything is a weapon," he roared. The human troops let out a savage cry and surged forward, wielding scavenged weapons, broken blades, and even their own helmets as bludgeons. Valzor felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Not anger, not frustration. Something far worse. Valzor had seen countless battles in his lifetime. He had commanded fleets that razed entire civilizations, led armies that crushed resistance without mercy. But nothing had prepared him for this. The humans were not fighting a war. They were surviving it. On the battlefield, his forces had every advantage. Numbers, technology, superior firepower. And yet, every tactical maneuver, every well-planned assault, crumbled under the sheer unpredictability of human combat. They fought without logic, without pattern, as if they thrived in the chaos. A squad of Xel'thar warriors moved in formation, their rifles trained forward, plasma bursts lighting up the smoke-filled air. Their targets, what remained of a human unit, were outnumbered, injured, and unarmed. Victory should have been assured. Then one of the humans did something insane. The man, bloodied and limping, ripped a piece of armor off a fallen Xel'thar soldier and hurled it like a discus. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't designed to kill. And yet, it struck Xel'thar's exposed breathing slit, causing him to stumble back, choking. Before the others could react, the rest of the humans attacked. One of them picked up a shattered energy rifle, not to fire, but to swing like a club, caving in an alien skull. Another yanked the battery pack from a broken plasma pistol, cracked it open with his bare hands, and jammed the exposed power core against an enemy's armor. A burst of energy surged through the Xel'thar's body, frying his nervous system instantly. It was like watching animals turned loose in a slaughterhouse, except these animals weren't running from death. They were wielding it. Xel'thar's claws clenched. "They fight without honor," he growled. His lieutenant hesitated before responding. "They fight to win, General." That was becoming painfully clear. Nearby, another squad of Xel'thar attempted to hold their position behind a collapsed transport, waiting for reinforcements. A human engineer, one of the weaker ones, barely armored, crawled through the wreckage like a scavenger. Before the Xel'thar could react, he had mixed two seemingly harmless chemicals from a fallen dropship's coolant system, creating a reaction that ignited the entire area. The explosion consumed everything. Xel'thar reeled back as the shockwave reached his command post. This was not how war was meant to be fought. It was supposed to be strategy against strategy, strength against strength. But humans turned everything into a weapon, even their own dead. He had seen it with his own eyes. A squadron of Xel'thar had broken through enemy lines earlier, only to find themselves overwhelmed not by soldiers, but by corpses. The humans had stacked their fallen like barriers, using their armor as makeshift shields. Some of the bodies had been rigged with explosives. Others had their weapons still clutched in stiff, lifeless hands, positioned to look like they were still ready to fire. It was psychological warfare, brutal and relentless. Xel'thar watched the battlefield shift again. His warriors were faltering. They were used to disciplined, tactical engagements, enemies who fought with rules. But humans had no rules. A sharp crack echoed through the air. One of his snipers toppled over. A jagged piece of metal lodged in his eye socket. A human in the distance lowered a makeshift slingshot, fashioned from a piece of torn body armor and a length of coiled wire. Xel'thar's breath came slow and measured, his mind racing. He had thought his species would crush humanity in a single campaign. But now, standing amidst the wreckage of what should have been his victory, he was beginning to realize the truth. This was not a war of technology. This was a war of ingenuity. And the humans were winning. Xel'thar watched in silence as the battlefield shifted yet again, but this time, something was different. The humans had stopped attacking in their usual reckless manner. They were no longer just scavenging weapons from the dead or crafting crude explosives from battlefield scraps. No, this was something worse. They had begun to understand Xel'thar technology. It had started with small things. A few humans had figured out how to bypass the safety mechanisms on discarded plasma rifles, overcharging them into unstable handheld bombs. Others had learned to drain power cores from damaged Xel'thar war machines and used them to supercharge their own crude weapons, turning simple bullets into armor-piercing nightmares. Then came the unthinkable. A captured human had somehow escaped his restraints, despite being shackled inside one of the most secure holding cells aboard a Xel'thar command ship. When the guards finally discovered how, their confusion turned to horror. The human had taken apart his own breathing mask, melted down its components using body heat and friction, and reshaped them into a lock-picking tool. "They are learning," Xel'thar muttered, his claws gripping the command table. "Faster than we expected." The confirmation came soon after. A Xel'thar scouting party had ventured deep into a war-torn city, expecting to find nothing but broken human defenses. Instead, they stumbled upon a terrifying sight. An entire group of human engineers gathered around a disabled Xel'thar walker, its massive mechanical frame still partially intact. At first, the Xel'thar had thought the humans were scavenging it for parts. But then, the walker's main cannon powered on. Before the scouts could react, the stolen war machine opened fire, obliterating them in a single blast. Somehow, the humans had reverse-engineered an alien war mech in the middle of battle. It made no sense. No species had ever adapted this quickly. Learning how to use enemy weapons was one thing, but learning how to modify them in real time Without instruction, without training, it was impossible. And yet it was happening. Reports came in of human pilots hijacking Xel'thar ships mid-flight, figuring out the controls on instinct alone. They weren't just repurposing weapons anymore. They were improving them. A human soldier, one that should have been long dead, had been spotted using a stolen Xel'thar energy rifle. Except the rifle was firing in bursts far more rapid than its original design allowed. He had overclocked it, sacrificing stability for sheer firepower, turning it into a weapon even the Xel'thar had never considered creating. Another report detailed an incident where humans had taken a disabled Xel'thar defense turret, strapped it onto the back of a transport truck, and drove it straight through enemy lines while firing wildly in all directions. A stationary gun had been turned into a mobile death machine. And then there was the worst report of them all. A lone human had managed to board a Xel'thar command ship. No one knew how. The security footage showed him sneaking through the corridors, completely unarmed. But instead of stealing weapons, he went straight to the ship's control room. In less than 5 minutes, he had reprogrammed the ship's security system to recognize humans as friendly and Xel'thar as intruders. The automated defenses turned against their own crew. 5 minutes. That was all it had taken for one human to turn an entire warship into a death trap for its own soldiers. Valzor stood frozen as he read the report, his mind struggling to comprehend it. The humans were no longer just fighting back. They were evolving. And if they weren't stopped soon, the war wouldn't just be lost. The Xel'thar species itself might not survive. The Xel'thar had fought hundreds of species across the galaxy. They had faced enemies with superior numbers, advanced weaponry, and terrifying war machines. But never before had they encountered an opponent that attacked their minds as much as their bodies. The humans had turned war into something else entirely. It started subtly. At first, Valzor thought his warriors were simply fatigued from the relentless combat. The constant assaults, the unpredictability of human tactics, the way they turned anything into a weapon. It was exhausting, even for an empire as disciplined as the Xel'thar. But then, the real war began. A Xel'thar forward base had been operating without issue, stationed near the ruins of a human city. The outpost was well fortified, heavily armed, and surrounded by motion sensors and automated defenses. There was no logical way for an enemy to infiltrate without setting off alarms. And yet, one night, the guards swore they heard whispers. Not through their communication systems, not from their own ranks. The voices came from outside the base, drifting through the air like ghostly echoes. The words were distorted, almost mechanical, but undeniably human. "You are already dead." The voice came from every direction, making it impossible to track. Some guards panicked and opened fire into the darkness. But there was nothing there. No movement, no heat signatures, only the wind and the eerie sound of unseen enemies taunting them. Then the lights flickered. The automated defenses briefly powered down. When they came back online, half the security footage had been erased. No alarms had been triggered, no signs of entry. Yet by morning, 3 Xel'thar soldiers were missing. Their weapons and armor were found neatly placed in the center of the camp, as if someone had left them there as a warning. Valzor listened to the report, his claws tapping against the metal surface of his war table. "They have no stealth technology," he muttered. "They have no psionics. How did they do this?" No one had an answer, and the psychological warfare only escalated from there. Xel'thar troops began hearing human battle cries echoing through abandoned buildings, only to find no humans inside. In some areas, strange symbols were painted onto the walls, simple human phrases written in blood or ash. "We see you. We are coming. Everything is a weapon." Then came the most disturbing attack of all. An elite Xel'thar unit was stationed in the lower levels of an occupied human city, holding the underground tunnels that led to critical supply routes. The area was completely secured, with no breaches detected. Then the lights went out. For exactly 7 minutes, the tunnels were plunged into total darkness. The Xel'thar's infrared vision should have given them an advantage, but their scanners were jammed. Their comms were filled with static. When the lights came back, the entire unit was dead. No gunfire had been exchanged. No energy weapons had been discharged. Their bodies showed no wounds, except for their helmets, which had been removed and placed neatly beside them. On the walls, written in what appeared to be Xel'thar blood, was a single word: Boo. Xel'thar clenched his fists. The humans were not just fighting to kill anymore. They were fighting to break their enemies, to make them afraid to sleep, to make them hesitate before firing a weapon. They are turning our own minds against us, one of his officers admitted, his voice shaking. Our soldiers are requesting to be reassigned. Some refuse to enter human-controlled zones entirely. Cowards. Weaklings. The Xel'thar had always prided themselves on being the most disciplined warriors in the galaxy. But discipline meant nothing against an enemy that refused to fight like a normal species. There were even whispers that the humans were listening to Xel'thar communications, despite having no access to their encrypted systems. It made no sense, and yet every time the Xel'thar planned an assault, the humans seemed to anticipate it. It was as if they were reading the enemy's mind. Paranoia spread like a virus. Soldiers hesitated before issuing commands, afraid that humans were already 2 steps ahead. Officers second-guessed their own strategies, wondering if the humans had allowed them to take certain positions just to set up a deadlier trap. The Xel'thar had fought many wars, but now, for the first time in their history, they were fighting ghosts. And the ghosts were winning. Xel'thar stood in the command chamber of his warship, staring at the holographic display of the battlefield below. His claws twitched against the control panel, his mind racing with calculations. None of it made sense. The humans should have been wiped out by now. The Xel'thar Empire had the finest military in the galaxy, the most advanced weaponry, the most disciplined soldiers. And yet, their forces were crumbling. This wasn't just a war anymore. It was a nightmare. Every attempt to regain control ended in disaster. His warriors no longer fought with confidence. They fought with hesitation, constantly looking over their shoulders, afraid of what the humans would do next. Even the elite divisions, the best of the Xel'thar military, were failing. Reports flooded in from across the front lines. One battalion had been ambushed by humans wielding Xel'thar energy rifles. The soldiers barely had time to react before their own technology was turned against them. The humans had figured out how to modify the weapons, making them fire at a faster rate with increased damage output. Another unit had taken refuge in a fortified command post, only to be eliminated without a single shot being fired. The humans had disrupted the environmental controls, flooding the base with extreme cold until the Xel'thar inside were too weak to fight back. The survivors had been found frozen, their weapons still in hand, their defenses intact, but their bodies unable to function. Then came the worst message of all. A fleet of Xel'thar warships had been engaged in an orbital battle, expecting an easy victory. The humans had no capital ships left, only a few stolen transports and salvaged fighters. The Xel'thar commanders had laughed at the idea of losing. But the humans had weaponized the battlefield itself. The debris field of past battles, scraps of metal, broken ships, shattered weapons, had been turned into an improvised minefield. Using nothing but scavenged thrusters and remotely activated charges, they had sent thousands of tons of wreckage hurtling toward the Xel'thar fleet. The warships had tried to maneuver, but the sheer chaos of the assault was overwhelming. Hulls were torn open, engines were crippled, and entire ships were torn apart, not by enemy fire, but by the very remains of their own previous victories. Xel'thar gritted his teeth. They are not just surviving anymore. Humans had adapted to the Xel'thar. They had taken every lesson the Empire had tried to teach them, every weapon, every tactic, and they had learned. Not just learned, improved. And now, they were striking back. A distress call came through from the surface. One of the last remaining Xel'thar outposts was under siege. Xel'thar tapped into the live feed, expecting to see an overwhelming force of human troops. Instead, he saw something far worse. Humans in Xel'thar armor. They had stripped the dead, taken their weapons, and even begun using Xel'thar military insignia to confuse automated defenses. Some had painted their stolen armor in human symbols, mocking the Empire. Others wore it in its original form, making it nearly impossible to distinguish them from real Xel'thar troops in the chaos of battle. His warriors hesitated, unable to tell friend from foe. That moment of doubt was all the humans needed. They struck with savage precision, cutting down confused Xel'thar soldiers before they even had a chance to fight back. "They have no limits," Xel'thar whispered, more to himself than anyone else. His second-in-command stood beside him, trembling. "General, our forces are requesting orders. What do we do?" Xel'thar's mind raced. He had fought for decades, won countless wars, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for an enemy like this. The humans should have been crushed. But instead, they had become the war itself. There was only one conclusion left to make. If the Xel'thar continued this war, it would not be humanity that perished. It would be them. Xel'thar had never felt fear before. Not as a young warrior, not as a rising commander, not even when he led the first charge into battle against the humans. But now, standing in the dim glow of his warship's command center, watching reports flood in from across the battlefield, he finally understood what it meant to be afraid. The war was lost. He hadn't admitted it yet. Not out loud, not even to himself. But the truth was undeniable. His forces were in full retreat, and the humans were no longer just defending their worlds. They were hunting the Xel'thar down. The reports were filled with impossible stories. Stories of human forces doing things no species should have been capable of. A heavily fortified Xel'thar supply convoy had been moving through the ruins of the city, protected by armored escorts and automated defenses. It should have been impenetrable. Yet, without a single shot fired, the entire convoy had been disabled. How? The humans had stolen Xel'thar power cores from previous battles, wired them into an improvised electromagnetic pulse device, and blasted the convoy with a field of energy that short-circuited everything. The escorts were left defenseless, their energy weapons useless, their vehicles dead in the dust. By the time reinforcements arrived, the humans were long gone, leaving nothing behind except a crude human phrase scrawled on the wreckage. "If it runs on power, it belongs to us now." Xel'thar's claws twitched as he read the words. Another report came in, this one from a Xel'thar battleship in orbit. It had been preparing for an orbital bombardment, ready to wipe out human resistance from above. But just as they powered up the main cannon, something had gone wrong. Their own targeting systems turned against them. Instead of firing at human strongholds, the ship's weapons locked onto Xel'thar troop positions. The crew scrambled to override the commands, but the ship refused to obey. By the time they discovered the cause, it was too late. A single human infiltrator had boarded the ship days before, hidden in the wreckage of a captured supply crate. He had remained undetected, moving through ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels, accessing systems no non-Xel'thar should have been able to understand. And in one brilliant, suicidal act, he had reprogrammed the entire ship's firing systems to attack its own forces before sealing himself inside an airlock and launching himself into space, vanishing before the Xel'thar could even capture him. Xel'thar's breath came slow and measured. It was happening everywhere. Entire garrisons were going dark overnight. Warships were losing control of their own systems. Xel'thar soldiers were deserting, claiming they had seen human shadows moving through the wreckage, whispering in their own language, taunting them. The humans weren't just fighting the Xel'thar anymore. They were consuming them. Xel'thar turned away from the reports, his mind racing. He had spent his life believing in the supremacy of the Xel'thar Empire, in their discipline, their strength, their right to rule the galaxy. But the humans had changed everything. They had started this war as a primitive, disorganized species, barely worth the attention of the Empire. And now, they were something else entirely. They had learned, adapted, evolved. And worst of all, they were enjoying it. "General," a voice interrupted his thoughts. Valzor turned to his second-in-command. The warrior was visibly shaken, his usually rigid posture faltering. It was a sight Valzor had never imagined he would see from one of his own. "Our forces are requesting orders," the officer said quietly. "Shall we launch another offensive?" Valzor stared at him for a long moment. Another offensive. Another wave of soldiers sent into the Grinder, only to be outmatched by human ingenuity. Another fleet launched into a battlefield that the humans had already turned into a death trap. No. The truth was clear now. The Xel'thar were no longer the hunters in this war. They were the prey. And if they did not end this war soon, there would be no Xel'thar left to fight. For the first time in his life, General Valzor, the most feared commander of the Xel'thar Empire, considered the unthinkable. Surrender. Valzor had never spoken the word before. For all his years of war, for all the victories he had claimed across the stars, surrender had never been an option. The Xel'thar Empire did not yield. It did not bow. It did not negotiate with lesser species. And yet, here he stood, staring at the final transmission from his remaining fleet commanders, knowing there was no other choice. The humans had broken them. Not through superior numbers, not through advanced technology, not even through overwhelming firepower. They had broken the Xel'thar by turning the very nature of war against them. Valzor had witnessed it firsthand, how humans weaponized everything they touched, how they turned defeat into innovation, how they refused to fight by the rules of war that Xel'thar had known for centuries. Even now, as his forces scrambled to retreat, the humans were still pushing forward. They didn't care about reclaiming their lost cities. They didn't care about negotiating peace. They wanted to make sure the Xel'thar never dared to return. On the surface, scattered Xel'thar forces tried to regroup, only to find their own weapons turned against them. Humans had reverse-engineered Xel'thar shields, modifying them to disrupt their energy signatures. The once impenetrable barriers of the Empire now flickered uselessly as human soldiers walked through them, weapons raised. A last-ditch attempt to retreat from one of the occupied cities had ended in disaster. The humans had taken control of the Xel'thar's own landing beacons, broadcasting false signals to warships in orbit. Thinking they were retrieving their soldiers, Xel'thar ships had landed in traps. Improvised explosives had been buried beneath landing zones. The second a ship touched down, the ground erupted in flames. Valzor clenched his fists, his claws digging into his own palms. He had lost count of how many warriors had fallen, how many ships had been destroyed, how many planets, once claimed in the name of the Xel'thar Empire, were now nothing more than burning wreckage. And the humans, they thrived in this destruction. For every Xel'thar ship that fell, they scavenged something new. For every battle they lost, they learned something the next wave of soldiers would use. They had weaponized defeat itself. Valzor took a slow breath. He had known this moment was coming. He had resisted it, denied it, raged against it. But now, the truth was clear. If the Xel'thar Empire did not surrender, there would be no Xel'thar left. His second-in-command stood before him, silent, waiting. The other officers did the same. No one wanted to say it out loud, but he could see it in their eyes. They all knew. He turned to the communications panel. His claws hovered over the controls. To surrender meant humiliation. It meant disgrace. It meant accepting that the humans, this primitive species, this race that had started the war with nothing but desperation, had done the impossible. They had won. His breath came slow and steady. Then, with a single motion, he pressed the command. A message was sent across all Xel'thar frequencies. The order echoed through the stars, through every remaining ship, every surviving warrior still clinging to the hope of victory. The war was over. The Xel'thar Empire surrendered. The humans had won. And in the silence that followed, as the weight of defeat settled upon him, Valzor whispered the words that no Xel'thar had ever spoken before. We should have never gone to war with them.